It is 3 a.m. in New York, 8 in Abuja, and 4 on a Friday afternoon here in Seoul. I'm Moon Gun-young. You're watching ARIRANG, Korea's only global network. Now, it was this time 1 month ago that we started learning the true extent of the horror unfolding off Korea's southwestern coast as a ferry with hundreds on board capsized. Fast forwarding to today, with nearly 300 dead and 20 still missing, investigators are zeroing on who should be held responsible for the disaster. Prosecutors want to talk to the practical owner of the sunken Sewolho ferry about his possible role in the disaster and called him for questioning earlier this Friday morning. But Yoo Byung-un was a no-show, and now the authorities are considering more forceful ways to bring him in. ARIRANG News Kim Ji-yeon starts us off.
Prosecutors have requested an arrest warrant for the de facto owner of the sunken Sewolho ferry, Yoo Byung-un, after he failed to show up for questioning earlier Friday over his alleged role in the ferry disaster. Yoo is believed to be holed up inside a religious compound in Anseong, Gyeonggi-do province, and authorities are reportedly considering using force to get inside. But around 400 members of a cult led by Yoo have surrounded the estate in protest of authorities who they claim are violating their religious freedoms. But prosecutors say their investigation has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the business irregularities of Yoo and his family, which may have led to the ferry sinking. Investigations point to negligence on the part of the ferry operator as playing a big part in the ferry accident, namely an overloading cargo onto the ferry for the sake of profits. Prosecutors suspect funds from the church were used by Yoo in business operations of the ferry operator. The 73-year-old was summoned to appear for questioning at 10 a.m. Friday local time, but he did not appear like his other family members who have ignored similar orders. A task force has been established to locate and arrest Yoo's first son, Tae-gyun, who is believed to have had a hand in the operations of the company that owned the Sewolho ferry. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
At the nation's top office, President Park Geun-hye sat down for talks at the top office with people representing the families of the Sewolho ferry victims. While the details of the Friday meeting haven't yet come out, President Park was expected to console the families and discuss with them the government's recovery efforts. Now, this comes after some families marched towards the presidential office last week to demand talks with the president. The Korean leader is expected to address the entire nation as early as next week to apologize for the government's failure to prevent the ferry tragedy. More than 300 people are either confirmed dead or missing in the nation's deadliest maritime disaster in decades. Let's turn our focus now to the upcoming local elections. Voter turnout is going to play a critical role in the outcome of the polls. Now, with Korea in a state of mourning over the ferry disaster, campaigning will be low-key, leading some to worry fewer people will feel inclined to vote. Now, if it plays out like this, the ruling party could be in for a torrid time come June 4th. Our political correspondent Ji Myung-gil reports.
By the end of the day, all candidates vying for seats in the June 4th local elections will have made their candidacies official. Registration for the 3,952 positions for grabs ends Friday for the local positions, which range from mayoral and provincial governor posts to councilors and ward members. The municipal elections will be viewed as a first chance to judge the current Park Geun-hye administration, and voter turnout will be a key factor in determining which political party wins. According to a February survey conducted by the polling organization Research Plus, 84% of respondents said they will vote or try to vote on June 4th. In a follow-up survey conducted this week, respondents were asked if the Sewolho ferry disaster had affected their determination to vote. 35.2% said it had, 21.1% said it hadn't. Meanwhile, an increase in independent voters could also play a critical role on election day. A survey conducted by mBrain suggests that of all voters on election day, 43.8% of them will be people with no party affiliation. Their perception of the job President Park Geun-hye has done over the past year could make a difference, and last month's ferry tragedy looms large. A survey by Gallup Korea shows that the president's approval ratings among women in their 40s was 62% on April 4th, before the ferry disaster. On May 2nd, 2 weeks after the accident, the figure had dropped 20 percentage points to 42%. Experts say it reflects the maternal instinct of women in their 40s who have children the same age as those who perished on the Sewolho ferry. There is speculation that candidates of the ruling Henry Party will take a beating on June 4th. Analysts aren't as sure. If the distrust in government keeps people away from the polls, they say, and the turnout falls below 40%, the ruling party could gain an upper hand. 김영길, ARIRANG News.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Business Today with Moon Gon-young. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
Turning now to Japan's push for a major reinterpretation of the country's pacifist constitution, which could pave the way for its military to fight overseas. The move announced Thursday is likely to raise tensions in Northeast Asia. Washington, however, says it supports and welcomes Tokyo's new military policy. Our Shin Se-min reports.
The United States says it supports Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's push for a reinterpretation of his country's pacifist constitution, a push for a larger military role as the U.S. wants Japan to carry the burden of its own defense. The State Department said on Thursday that it welcomes Tokyo's push for expanding its military's international presence. Japan seeks to exercise a so-called collective self-defense right to actively defend itself and allow its armed forces to enter battle in defense of its allies in case of any attack. Washington says it favors Japan's internal debate on what the Constitution grants and whether to allow the right to collective self-defense. South Korea's foreign ministry on Thursday urged Japan to use its powers for peaceful purposes aimed at maintaining regional security. It also emphasized that Tokyo needs to seek confirmation from Seoul regarding Korean Peninsula issues.
Japan will only be able to influence security issues on the Korean Peninsula upon our request.
The Chinese government criticized the Abe administration for taking negative actions and expressed concerns about the country's intentions, adding that neighboring Asian countries have full reason to be highly vigilant over Tokyo's true intentions.
We've noted that the Abe administration has taken a series of unprecedented actions in the areas of military and security since taking office, linking it with a recent series of negative trends in Japan regarding the issue of history.
Abe's military push has also divided opinion in Japan. Well over 2,000 protesters formed a human chain around the Diet building in Tokyo on Thursday to oppose the administration's attempt to scrap Japan's pacifist ideals. People of all ages took part in the rally, including those who experienced World War II under Japan's military government. In an effort to address those concerns, Abe said Thursday that Japan will stick to a peaceful path and will never wage any war. There are doubts Abe's proposal will win the full support of his own ruling coalition, so the Japanese leader will have to build consensus to win cabinet approval. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
The anti-China protests in Vietnam are spreading and becoming increasingly violent. The latest reports have at least 21 people being killed in rioting on Wednesday evening, including 5 Vietnamese workers and 16 others who are believed to be Chinese, although that numbers are under dispute. The unrest began earlier this week at a steel mill in central Vietnam with protests against a Chinese oil rig that's been deployed in an area of the South China Sea claimed by both Vietnam and China. Now, Beijing vowed Thursday it would continue to drill for oil at the rig, while Hanoi has demanded its removal, sending ships to the area in response. And despite those violent protests in Vietnam, China isn't backing down from its plans of stationing an oil rig in the South China Sea. A top Chinese military official on a visit to the U.S. said oil drilling will continue in disputed waters, and he had words for Hanoi and Washington alike. Our Chae-Sun has more.
After meeting with his U.S. counterpart General Martin Dempsey at the Pentagon Thursday, the chief of the General Staff of the Chinese People's Liberation Army said he will continue drilling for oil in disputed waters. He said they belong to China and that the nation couldn't afford to lose an inch of its territory. Blaming Hanoi for disrupting Sino-Vietnam relations by sending ships to the area, the Chinese general also had a message for Washington.
I would like to also express hope that the United States can hold an objective view on the issues in the South China and East China Seas.
Fang also criticized U.S. President Barack Obama's strategic military rebalancing in Asia for giving some countries in the region leverage to make territorial claims in the seas. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the talks said the so-called pivot to Asia was necessary to protecting regional peace and stability amid mounting security threats from North Korea.
We also discussed the tensions in the South China Sea and how provocative actions can lead to confrontation. These issues need to be resolved through dialogue and international law.
Since the arrival of the Chinese oil rig in waters near the disputed Paracel Islands earlier this month, Beijing and Hanoi have each sent vessels to surround it. Anti-Chinese protests in southern Vietnam, which erupted Tuesday, spread north, and the foreign ministry there has confirmed one death from the clashes. China's state-run Xinhua news agency has reported at least 2 Chinese nationals were killed. The Chinese foreign minister spoke with the Vietnamese deputy prime minister Thursday, urging Hanoi to take measures to protect the safety of Chinese nationals and companies in Vietnam. Chae-Sun, ARIRANG News.
Let's shift our focus to Turkey. The sorrow and anger there is palpable. 4 days after an explosion at a mine, there is no news of any more survivors. The death toll now stands at 284, and at least 140 others are believed to be trapped inside. While the dead are being buried, protests against the government are breaking out all across the country. Our Kwon So-ah reports.
As the death toll from the worst mining accident in Turkey's history moves closer to 300, a wave of sorrow and anger is sweeping the country. The first funerals of victims were held in a local cemetery near the accident site as excavators were digging new graves. The whole nation is in mourning, and the outrage against the government is growing over its indifference to poor safety conditions.
The company calls the inspectors and they come. The mining company shuts down the shaft they work in, tells the inspectors it's not being used, and that's it. Once the inspectors are gone, they reopen that shaft. They should hold inspections unannounced.
Thousands of Turkey's major trade unions have joined in a 24-hour strike, and clashes broke out in the country's third-largest city of Izmir, 120 kilometers from Soma, where the ill-fated mine is located. Police used water cannons and tear gas to break up demonstrations. A union boss there was said to have been hospitalized. Newly released images are also fueling the outrage. A photo of one of Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's aides kicking a protester as he's being held down by Special Forces police triggered a firestorm of anti-government sentiments. Local newspapers published the picture, citing him as a deputy chief of staff, and reported that the incident began when the protester had kicked a vehicle in Erdogan's convoy on Wednesday. The disaster has given fuel to an already outraged segment of the Turkish population, upset over corruption allegations surrounding the prime minister and those closest to him. Prime Minister Erdogan earlier tried to defend his government by pointing out that such disasters occur everywhere. Meanwhile, Turkey's President Abdullah Gül visited Soma on Thursday and said the mine tragedy is a sorrow for the whole Turkish nation. Rescue efforts continue, but as the days pass, the hope for finding any survivors is gradually fading. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
President Park Geun-hye met with the visiting Director General of the World Trade Organization today. Both endorsed the expansion of a global multilateral trade system and trade liberalization. Now, the president and WTO chief Roberto Azevedo agreed that Korea had effectively made trade the driving force of its economic growth. Both also saw the need to bolster monitoring of trade protectionism, as free trade is seen as being an essential means of bringing the world out of recession. The president also asked Azevedo to support Koreans in their attempts to find opportunities at the WTO Secretariat in Geneva. Economic recovery is well established in most advanced economies around the world. That is, according to Korea's top central banker. Speaking of the discussions at a recent Bank of International Settlements meeting, Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol cited positive economic indicators in the U.S., Japan, and European countries. Lee said that the U.S. economy is expected to bounce back from a slowdown in the first quarter this year, brought on by the harsh winter weather. Now, the governor, however, added that participants were attentive to the Chinese economy and the geopolitical risks stemming from the crisis in Ukraine. Now, for those of you curious about the health of the chairman of Samsung Electronics, Lee Geun-hye is on the path to recovery, says his doctors. The 72-year-old has been hospitalized since last weekend after suffering a heart attack, and some reports have said that he is in critical condition. Well, according to doctors at Samsung Medical Center, where he is being treated, that is not the case, who said his health is actually improving. They did say, however, that the chairman was still being sedated. The Korean government released the National Balance Sheet 2014 earlier this week, the first of its kind in the country. And according to this report, the nation's wealth was some 10.6 quadrillion won as of the end of 2012, and that's roughly $10 trillion and 7.7 times the nation's GDP. Let's take a closer look at this balance sheet. For that, Dr. Kim Byung-ju, our regular contributor, joins me live in the studio. Good afternoon, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
So, according to this new national balance sheet, is it?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Korea's national wealth amounts to a little over 10 quadrillion won,
right,
which means 212 million won. That's about $200,000
right,
per person.
That's a mouthful of numbers, I suppose,
yes,
just
very
to
much so.
present them, right? Yes, indeed. And it sounds like Korean people are quite wealthy, just based on that per person national wealth figures. But we have some interesting numbers here that shows right here on the screen. As you mentioned, the size of this, what's called national wealth, is as large as 7.7 times of the national GDP. And compare that with other countries' case. And what does this mean? This actually means a possibility that Korean economy may not be as productive here, because you want to have a wealth that produces lots of output. And GDP is an output, and when GDP is large, the number should be lower. And so in that case, Korea has this much of wealth, but it's not producing as much of GDP. So since the GDP output itself is smaller, you have this larger number for Korea. That is the rationale. And some of the economies, just it's my opinion, but relatively speaking, less productive economies like Japan and France, meaning that they have also high value for real estate, mm-hmm, and their numbers are actually lower than us, meaning that they're potentially more productive than us. So this actually means a challenge. We have expensive assets under our belt, but the GDP is not as big as it should be, perhaps.
So expensive assets that do not produce outcome,
yeah,
real estate for one.
That's
and
right,
that's been noted as a problem, that real estate just makes up too large a portion of, mm-hmm, of that number.
Right, indeed. It's more than half, indeed. Let's bring up the graph here, and that will tell us about as much as 53% of the Korea's national wealth is made of real estate, as you mentioned, so more than half. And the productive ones, such as facilities and perhaps buildings and machineries, for instance, they're not even half. And the others also include inventories, the products that were not sold, and some of the intellectual property rights related products and so on. So indeed, once again, I think this supports my own speculation that we have relative low productivity in terms of its potential.
Right, of course, real estate has always been and still is a very important factor for Korean households, and real estate is high in value here in Korea.
Right.
And experts have pointed out that makes household assets seem larger than it actually is, compared to, let's say, the government, for one.
Right, that's really true, because Korean households have been actively borrowing money to buy real estate. It's like until a few years ago, I suppose, with an expectation that they will rise. We have this large size of real estate under the belt of households, and that makes overall households portion of the economy quite large. Actually, a large household portion of the economy itself is not a bad thing, as long as they have assets that could be used more productively. But if we have lots of assets that are in the form of real estate, they cannot be used as productively.
That aren't lucrative.
No, not at all. They're not like financial assets or machineries or anything like that. So, but anyway, the bottom line is this is where we get a large size of household portion within the national wealth.
So I think it's important to really point out how heavily dependent Korean households are on real estate assets.
Right. Let's take a look at the numbers. Bring up the bar charts here, and that's very interesting. We should have it on the screen here of bar charts, relative size of real estate in the household asset right there. 66% as compared to the United States and the Netherlands, for instance. So, which means, like theoretically, the Americans may have actually about close to 70% of their assets in the form of liquid financial assets that could be reinvested elsewhere in productive industry and so on. But in Korea, we have only about 34% that's liquid that could be invested elsewhere. So that's a real challenge.
Well, how does Korea's real estate portion of each household's wealth to GDP compared with other countries?
Let's bring up
another chart.
Yeah, another chart that should be very interesting here on the screen. Okay, the Korea sits on the top then, and I don't think that's a really desirable top right there. And as you can see, Canada's case looks like their real estate value itself as compared to GDP is about over 1.0.
That's understandable because of the vast landmass that they have.
That's right, indeed. So that's good. And Korea's case, we are higher than France, higher than Japan, and the Netherlands, of course. But keep in mind what's been happening in Japan, going down, the value of real estate going down. So what I'm seeing here is a possibility that Korea, following Japan's example, from the point where we stand right now, where real estate may be overvalued, and we'll have to whose value needs to be readjusted in the longer run, just like what has been happening in Japan.
Right. So let's talk about this. All this data are based on this newly created something called the National Balance Sheet.
Right.
Now, how can we summarize the significance of this report?
The significance comes from its availability itself. It used to be the Statistics Korea used to compile the data on the real sector assets on one hand, and then Bank of Korea used to compile the data on the financial side of the assets. But this is the first time that they are combining these two together. And it has been coming on the way for quite some time because it needed lots of work. And Bank of Korea, for one, has been working on this project for the last about 6 years. And finally, they have the first outcome here. And this is good because even real estate assets, they're based on current values, which has been quite I suppose, revolutionary and dramatic because it's very difficult to use current values, but they are using it here. So this is a good indicator, indeed, for checking and measuring Korea's national wealth. And we have the first report, and we are looking forward to the following reports as they come along.
Right, but I've been hearing that not every country creates such balance sheet, national balance sheet, according to the international standards.
Right.
So hopefully, if more countries adopt this system, we'll be able to better compare where our standings are and how vulnerable our economy is.
That's for sure. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Kim Byung-ju, thank you so much for today and all of this week.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it is a perfect day weather-wise to finish off the week, and it feels like summer outside with the daytime highs rising mostly into the mid-20s and even the low 30s in some regions. Now, with this sunny day comes the high UV levels, so make sure to apply enough sunblock and be aware of the ozone concentration level as well, which can get quite high on a day like this. Now, going over to our temperature readings, Seoul will start off. Seoul will top out at 26 this afternoon, and meanwhile the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will peak up to 27 and 26 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops out at 25, Dokdo at 20, while Mangungang tops out at 9. Now as for the weather conditions down in Jindo, the skies are clear, but from today until Sunday we're expecting the fastest tide of the year at a speed of 2.8 meters per second, making search efforts abroad the sunken Sewol ferry disaster. Now that's all I have at this moment. I'm Michelle Park Geun-hye. Back to you, Kanyang.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. And that is your business today on this Friday. Thank you for watching. Do join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.